Canada's premiers intend to go to Washington next week to make their case on why Trump's threat to impose tariffs will hurt Americans as well as Canadians. Trump has given Canada a reprieve until March the 4th, and today the premiers and the Prime Minister held another virtual meeting to come up with strategies, including how to rapidly improve trading relationships between the provinces so companies don't have to rely so heavily on the U.S. David Akin is exploring that. David.
Well, Donna, there's economists who say dropping internal trade barriers could add billions to Canada's overall GDP. And in the wake of Trump's tariff threats, there is a new urgency to deal with those barriers.
I can tell you, having spoken to a number of premiers, the premiers are ready, the country is ready, businesses are ready.
And that's why Ottawa and the provinces are confident some barriers can be rapidly removed.
So you're going to see these barriers coming down, and there is no need for legislation in order for that to happen.
We are not the enemy.
Talks among the Prime Minister and the Premiers focused on three themes. First, harmonizing trucking regulations that can be wildly different from province to province. Second, improving labor mobility by making sure professional credentials earned in one province are honored by another. And third, removing some of the hundreds of exceptions, like liquor store sales, that each province insisted on when the Canadian Free Trade Agreement was signed in 2017.
The federal government is committed to us that they'll knock off as many barriers as possible. We'll do the same, and every other province will do the same. We need to have free trade right across this country.
But premiers also had their own demands of the Prime Minister. Some pressed Ottawa to streamline or reduce regulatory approvals to get big infrastructure projects moving. And some pressed Trudeau to name that fentanyl czar as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister said that he would convene a one-day Canada-U.S. economic summit this Friday in Toronto, where business and union leaders, as well as policy experts, will be asked for their ideas to grow Canada's economy without America's help. Donna.
Okay, David Akin, thank you. Why so many barriers to interprovincial trade exist is curious. Nobody knows them better than truckers and companies that deliver goods across the country. Touria Izri walks us through some of the roadblocks to trade within Canada.
Every time truck drivers cross provincial lines, they face a new set of regulations.
The West Coast is a lot different than Ontario, Quebec, and then you get New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. It's a whole different ballgame.
Roch La Victoire was a long-haul truck driver for 20 years and wants to see internal barriers slashed.
It would make life so much easier for these guys.
Those differences trickle down to other industries.
A major issue that grain farmers face is the trucking of their grain between provinces. So different provinces have different weights that they allow.
The patchwork of regulations across the provinces often reduce productivity and raise prices. One study found that internal trade barriers add an additional 8% to freight costs, which are ultimately passed down to the consumer.
It's just so many. It's death by a thousand cuts.
Some barriers are well known, like the flow of alcohol, but there are others. Different standards for meat, maple syrup, work boots, even toilet seats at construction sites.
Not every province has the same barriers as another, but they're equivalent to 21% tariffs. So for Quebec's case, it's actually 25% tariffs.
It's not just the flow of goods that are affected, but also people.
There's all kinds of reasons, safety reasons, accreditations. A lot of these decisions are held at the provincial level.
But doing so is not without political costs, especially for industries that may lose their competitive edge in certain provinces. But business leaders say the country as a whole is losing out.
This crisis that we're in, even in the interim, is an opportunity for us to have those conversations and get commitments from governments.
One less roadblock as Canada looks to become more self-reliant in the face of an existential threat. Touria Izri, Global News, Ottawa.